The grand hall of the alien palace was a spectacle unlike anything Jack Renshaw had ever seen. Towering crystal spires lined the walls, reflecting soft hues of blue and silver that seemed to shimmer with life. Alien dignitaries, dressed in elaborate robes adorned with glowing patterns, stood silently, their large, luminescent eyes fixed on the lone human at the center of the room. Jack shifted uncomfortably under their gazes, his suit feeling far too plain and out of place amidst the grandeur. As Earth's envoy to the Zorathian Empire, he had been sent to discuss a potential trade agreement, a mission that could solidify peace between their species. The stakes were high, but Jack was no stranger to pressure, or so he thought. Queen Syraxis entered the room with a regal presence that silenced even the faintest whispers. She was tall, her silver skin gleaming under the crystalline lights. Her deep violet eyes held an intensity that made Jack's heart skip a beat. Her elaborate crown of intertwined metals and gemstones seemed to hover just above her head, and her flowing robes moved as though carried by an invisible breeze. Jack straightened his back, determined to make a good impression. He had rehearsed his lines, memorized the cultural protocols. Well, most of them, and was confident he could navigate this delicate negotiation. However, nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. As Syraxis approached, her gaze locked onto Jack's with an unreadable expression. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Deciding to take the initiative, he placed a hand over his chest and bowed slightly, hoping to convey respect. It was a gesture he had seen in the cultural briefings, though he hadn't fully understood its significance. The hall fell deathly silent. Syraxis' eyes widened, and a ripple of shock spread through the gathered nobles. Jack froze, suddenly aware that he had done something wrong. Very wrong. The queen's lips curved into a small smile. A dangerous, calculating smile. "You proposed to me?" she asked, her voice echoing through the hall like a melody laced with steel. "Propose," Jack repeated, his voice cracking slightly. No, I." He stopped mid-sentence as his translator Ai whispered in his ear. In Zorathian culture, placing a hand over your heart and bowing is a direct marriage proposal. Congratulations. Jack's stomach dropped. His brain scrambled for a way to fix the misunderstanding. But before he could utter another word, Syraxis raised her hand. "I accept." The hall erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs. Jack's jaw hung open as two Zorathian attendants approached, gesturing for him to follow. He was whisked away before he could protest, leaving him with one thought echoing in his mind. What have I just done? As the doors closed behind him, Jack realized he had unintentionally proposed to the most powerful being in the Zorathian Empire. And she had said yes. Jack sat on the edge of a plush, circular couch in a chamber that could only be described as alien opulence. The walls shimmered like liquid gold, and floating orbs of light hovered above, illuminating the room with a warm glow. But Jack wasn't paying attention to the beauty around him. His mind was racing. "I proposed. How is this even happening?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his already messy hair. The translator AI embedded in his ear buzzed to life. "Technically, you didn't mean to propose, but you did use the Zorathian gesture for a formal marriage proposal. To refuse now would be a grave insult." "Great," Jack groaned. "How bad are we talking here?" "Bad enough to spark a diplomatic incident or possibly a war," the AI replied in its annoyingly calm tone. Jack leaned back and sighed. He had studied for weeks before coming to this planet, reading countless reports on Zorathian culture. But apparently, he had missed one very critical detail: their marriage traditions. Before he could dwell on his mistake, the double doors of the chamber slid open with a soft hum. Two Zorathian attendants entered, their silver skin glowing faintly. Behind them, Queen Syraxis strode in, her presence commanding the room. Jack shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "Human," Syraxis began, her voice as smooth as silk. "I am impressed by your boldness. Few would dare propose to a queen on their first meeting." Jack opened his mouth to correct her, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain this without offending her? She continued, stepping closer. "It is clear to me that your people value courage. You have shown great respect by offering yourself as a consort." Jack's brain scrambled for a response. Your Majesty, there's been a misunderstanding." Her eyes narrowed slightly, silencing him. "There is no misunderstanding, Jack Renshaw. You made the gesture. I accepted. Our union will bring great strength to both our peoples." Jack gulped. The room felt smaller suddenly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was serious. Completely, utterly serious. "Of course," Syraxis added, "there are traditions to follow. You will need to prove your worth as my chosen mate." Jack blinked. "Prove my worth?" She smiled, a faint curve of her lips that could either be amusement or warning. "There will be trials, physical, intellectual, and moral. Only those who succeed in these trials are deemed worthy of standing by the Queen." Jack wanted to protest, but the look in her eyes told him it was not optional. He glanced at the attendants, who were already preparing for the next step. "Trials? Jack muttered under his breath. How hard could they be? The Queen's smile widened ever so slightly. "Rest well, human. The first trial begins tomorrow. Let us see if you truly deserve the honor you have claimed." As Syraxis turned to leave, Jack sank back onto the couch, realizing this was only the beginning of his unintended royal adventure. Jack stood in the center of a grand arena, his palms sweating as thousands of Zorathians watched from the towering crystalline stands. Their shimmering skin and glowing eyes made them look like living stars in the crowd. The air buzzed with anticipation, and Jack could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him. The arena itself was a massive circular platform, with shifting tiles that moved in unpredictable patterns. Symbols carved into the tiles glowed faintly, pulsing with an energy Jack didn't understand. In front of him stood a large archway with intricate alien designs. It hummed softly, emitting a faint light. From her elevated throne at the edge of the arena, Queen Syraxis watched him intently. She looked calm, regal, and unshaken. Jack, on the other hand, felt like a nervous wreck. "What exactly am I supposed to do here?" Jack muttered to himself. The translator AI in his ear chimed in. "Your first trial is called the Test of Insight. The glowing symbols on the tiles are part of an ancient Zorathian puzzle. You must decipher the sequence and align the symbols correctly to open the archway. Failure to complete the puzzle will result in disqualification and possibly public humiliation." "Fantastic," Jack whispered sarcastically. "No pressure." An attendant stepped forward and raised a long ceremonial staff. The sound of a gong echoed through the arena, signaling the start of the trial. Jack stared at the glowing tiles beneath his feet, which shifted and rearranged themselves into a chaotic mess. The crowd fell silent, waiting to see what the human would do. Jack crouched down, inspecting the symbols closely. They were strange yet oddly familiar. His brain kicked into overdrive as he tried to recall the briefing materials he had skimmed before the mission. One symbol looked like a starburst, another resembled a spiral galaxy. The patterns seemed to represent celestial formations. "Okay," Jack muttered. "Think, Jack. This isn't just random. There's always a logic to puzzles like this." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped onto one of the tiles. The tile lit up, and a low hum filled the air. Encouraged, Jack stepped onto another tile with a similar symbol. It glowed brighter, and the hum grew louder. "Good start," he said to himself, taking a deep breath. As he moved forward, the puzzle became more complicated. The symbols started shifting positions, and the tiles he had already activated began to dim. Sweat dripped down his brow as he realized the puzzle wasn't just a test of memory. It required quick thinking and adaptability. The crowd murmured softly as Jack hesitated, but he ignored them, focusing on the patterns. He noticed a faint rhythm in the glowing lights, like a heartbeat. That was it. The sequence was timed to the pulse of the lights. With newfound confidence, Jack began stepping on the tiles in rhythm with the glow. The archway responded, its hum growing louder until, finally, the symbols aligned, and the archway burst into radiant light. The crowd erupted into cheers. Jack turned to see Queen Syraxis nodding in approval, her expression unreadable. The first trial was over, but Jack knew this was just the beginning. Jack sat in a small chamber after the trial, gulping down water from a silver flask handed to him by a Zorathian attendant. His heart was still racing, though he couldn't tell if it was from the adrenaline of solving the puzzle or the roar of thousands of alien spectators. Either way, one thing was clear. He had survived the first trial. But for how long? Before he could catch his breath, the door slid open with a soft hiss. A tall Zorathian figure entered, dressed in flowing dark robes with intricate silver embroidery. The alien's expression was sharp and calculating, his glowing eyes narrowing as he approached. Jack stiffened, unsure of what to expect. "Human," the alien said, his voice smooth, but laced with something Jack couldn't quite place. "I am Visor Kaler, advisor to Queen Syraxis." Jack stood awkwardly, offering a half-smile. Nice to meet you. Can I help you with something?" Kaler ignored the question, his gaze piercing. "You performed admirably in the trial. Far better than most expected." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of Kaler's words. "Thanks, I guess. I just figured it out as I went." Kaler's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Do not mistake me for someone impressed by luck. Your presence here has caused quite a stir among the nobles." Jack frowned. "A stir? How so?" The advisor stepped closer, his tone dropping to a whisper. "There are those who see your union with the Queen as a threat to the balance of power. Many believe a human has no place beside her." Jack's stomach churned. "Well, for the record, this wasn't exactly my idea." Kaler tilted his head, studying Jack as if trying to decide whether he was an ally or an obstacle. "Intentional or not, you have become part of Zorathian politics. If you wish to survive here, you must tread carefully. Not everyone in the Queen's court will be as welcoming as I am." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Welcoming? You're not exactly rolling out the red carpet here." Kaler's expression darkened. "Consider this a warning. There are forces at play that would see you fail the next trial, perhaps even lose your life." A chill ran down Jack's spine. He wanted to argue, to say that none of this was his fault, but he held his tongue. Kaler's words hung heavy in the air, a reminder that he was far from home and surrounded by a culture he barely understood. Before Jack could respond, Kaler stepped back, his tone shifting to something more formal. "The next trial will test your strength, both physical and mental. Prepare yourself, human. If you falter, there will be no second chances." With that, Kaler turned and left the chamber, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. The warning played over and over in his mind as he realized the gravity of his situation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving, not just to Syraxis, but to everyone watching, that he belonged here. The arena was different this time. Instead of a flat, shifting platform, it was a rugged landscape filled with jagged rocks, uneven terrain, and strange glowing plants. Jack stood at one end, squinting under the harsh, artificial sunlight pouring from above. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, their glowing eyes fixed on him, eager to see how the fragile human would fare in this trial. Queen Syraxis watched from her throne high above, her face unreadable as always. Jack couldn't decide whether she was rooting for him or just observing out of curiosity. Either way, it didn't matter. He was on his own. "This is it," Jack muttered, glancing around. "Looks like a bad hiking trail." His translator AI buzzed in his ear. "The trial will not remain this simple. Be prepared for challenges beyond the terrain." "Great. Thanks for the motivational speech," Jack replied sarcastically. A deep gong echoed through the arena, signaling the start of the trial. Jack took a cautious step forward, the rocks crunching beneath his boots. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the murmurs of the crowd and his own breathing. Then the ground trembled. Jack stumbled, nearly losing his footing as a large section of the rocky terrain shifted. From beneath the ground, a massive mechanical beast emerged. It resembled a predator, with metallic claws, glowing red eyes, and sharp, angular features. Its body hummed with energy, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Jack's eyes widened. Oh, come on. They didn't say anything about fighting a robot. The translator AI chimed in again. This is a test of strength. The Zorathians value not just physical power, but cleverness in the face of overwhelming odds. You are expected to outsmart or defeat the beast. Fantastic, Jack muttered, his heart pounding as the mechanical creature roared and charged toward him. He dove to the side just in time, narrowly avoiding the beast's claws. Scrambling to his feet, he looked around for anything he could use. The rocks, though sharp, wouldn't do much against metal. The glowing plants, however, caught his attention. He remembered something from the cultural briefings. Zorathian flora often had unique properties. As the beast lunged again, Jack sprinted toward one of the glowing plants, ducking and weaving to avoid its swipes. He grabbed a handful of the strange, pulsing leaves and crushed them in his hands. A faint, acrid smell filled the air. The beast turned, its glowing eyes locking onto Jack. It lunged again, but this time, Jack threw the crushed leaves into its face. The reaction was immediate. The creature reared back, its systems sparking and glitching as the plant's chemicals interfered with its circuitry. Bingo, Jack muttered, a small grin forming. The crowd gasped as the mechanical beast stumbled and collapsed, its red eyes dimming. Jack stood over the defeated machine, breathing heavily but victorious. Queen Syraxis rose from her throne, her expression still calm, but Jack swore he saw a flicker of admiration in her eyes. The second trial was over, but Jack knew the hardest challenges were yet to come. The third trial was nothing like the others. There was no grand arena, no cheering crowd, and no mechanical monsters. Instead, Jack found himself standing at the edge of a dark, cavernous pit, the only light coming from faintly glowing crystals embedded in the walls. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. Queen Syraxis stood nearby, flanked by two attendants. Her violet eyes seemed to pierce straight through Jack as she gestured toward the pit. This trial is not one of strength or insight, but of trust, she said, her voice calm but firm. Jack frowned, glancing at the pit. Trust? Trust in what? Syraxis stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. In this trial, you must descend into the abyss of shadows and retrieve the artifact at the bottom. However, you cannot do it alone. Jack raised an eyebrow. Okay, so who's helping me? From the shadows emerged a Zorathian warrior clad in dark armor. His silver skin gleamed faintly in the dim light, and his expression was one of barely concealed disdain. Jack recognized him immediately. Tarek, one of Syraxis' most loyal and feared generals. Jack had seen him before, standing silently behind the queen, always watching. Wait, he's my partner? Jack asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Syraxis nodded. Yes. Trust must be earned, human, especially in Zorathian culture. You and Tarek will work together to retrieve the artifact. If either of you fails to cooperate, both of you will fail the trial. Tarek stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. I do not trust humans, he said bluntly, his voice cold. You are weak and unpredictable. Jack crossed his arms. Great, because I don't trust people who look like they're ready to stab me in the back. Syraxis raised a hand, silencing them both. Trust is not given freely, but it is essential for survival. You will descend together. Prove that you can rely on one another, or fail together. Jack sighed, knowing he had no choice. The stakes were too high to let personal differences get in the way. Fine, he said reluctantly. Let's get this over with. Tarek grunted but didn't argue. Together, they descended into the pit using a rope made of some strange, glowing material. The deeper they went, the darker and colder it became. Jack could barely see, relying on the faint glow of the crystals to guide him. As they reached the bottom, they were met with a new challenge, a maze of tunnels that twisted and turned in every direction. The artifact could be anywhere. "This way," Tarek said, pointing to a tunnel. Jack hesitated. "And how do you know that?" "I don't," Tarek admitted, his tone grudging. "But staying here will get us nowhere." Jack sighed again but followed. As they navigated the maze, they encountered traps, collapsing walls, sudden pits, and even strange creatures that emerged from the shadows. Each time, they had to work together to survive. Tarek saved Jack from a falling rock, and Jack disarmed a trap before it could catch Tarek. Slowly, grudgingly, a sense of mutual respect began to form. At the heart of the maze, they found the artifact, a glowing orb resting on a pedestal. Together, they retrieved it and made their way back to the surface. By the time they emerged, battered but alive, the tension between them had lessened. Syraxis watched as they presented the artifact. For the first time, Jack thought he saw a hint of approval in Tarek's stern expression. The trial was complete, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that earning the Queen's trust was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Trials were over for now, but Jack wasn't feeling any relief. Queen Syraxis had grown quieter in the days that followed, her attention often drifting toward the growing unrest in her court. Jack could sense that something was changing, and not for the better. Even the usually unshakable Tarek had started to act more distant. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The air in the palace had grown thick with tension, and the whispers of the nobles were becoming louder, more urgent. It wasn't just his accidental proposal anymore. It was something far more dangerous. One evening, Jack found himself in his quarters, pacing back and forth. He had just finished his evening meal when the door creaked open. He turned, startled to see Tarek standing there, his expression hard as ever. "You've been summoned," Tarek said, his voice low. "Summoned," Jack repeated, raising an eyebrow. "By who?" "The Queen," Tarek replied curtly, stepping aside to let Jack pass. "There are matters to discuss, important matters." Jack's heart raced as he followed the Zorathian warrior down the long corridors of the palace. The atmosphere felt heavy, the silence unnerving. As they approached the Queen's chamber, Jack noticed the usual guards were absent. Instead, a small group of nobles, some familiar, some unfamiliar, stood in the shadows. Syraxis stood at the center of the room, her back to them, gazing out of the massive windows that overlooked the sprawling city below. Jack couldn't help but notice how distant she seemed, her regal posture now holding an air of uncertainty. "Jack Renshaw," Syraxis said, turning to face him. Her voice was cold, guarded. "There are things happening within my empire that cannot be ignored, some things that concern you." Jack swallowed hard. He had expected something like this, but he wasn't ready for the weight of her words. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Syraxis' gaze flickered briefly to the nobles who were now watching him with cold eyes. "There are those who do not believe in our union. They think your presence here is a threat. They fear what you represent, a human, unworthy of my trust, of my throne." Jack's pulse quickened. He knew that some of the nobles had been upset about his accidental proposal, but he didn't realize it had grown this serious. "Who are they?" Jack asked, his hands clenched at his sides. "Who's behind this?" Syraxis' lips tightened, her eyes narrowing. "It's not just one group. There are many, influential families who seek to destabilize my rule, to push me back into the shadows where I was before you came." Jack's mind raced. "So, they're plotting against you." "They are plotting against both of us," she replied, her voice low but resolute. "I cannot stand idle while they weaken my position. You must help me. You must expose them before they strike." The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had just completed the trials, earned some measure of respect, but now the true game of politics had begun. It wasn't just about surviving the challenges anymore. It was about surviving the deadly web of Zorathian power struggles. Jack's gaze shifted to the nobles who stood by, their faces unreadable. The walls felt like they were closing in. "You'll need to watch your back," Tarek said, his voice gruff as he stepped forward. "There are no allies here, only enemies wearing the faces of friends." Jack nodded, a sense of dread settling over him. The conspirators had made their move, and now it was up to him and Syraxis to stop them. But Jack knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to be easy, and it would require every ounce of his wit, strength, and courage to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. The trials had only just begun. Jack's heart was pounding as he stood at the door of the hidden chamber deep within the palace. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that made him feel like he was about to make a move that could change everything. He had spent the last few days gathering what little information he could about the conspirators. Now it was time to act. The stakes had never been higher. He glanced over at Syraxis, who stood beside him, her posture regal and unyielding. Though her eyes were calm, Jack could feel the pressure weighing down on her. The entire empire, her empire, seemed to be on the verge of collapse, and he knew she was depending on him, on them, more than ever. "This is it," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Once we open this door, there's no turning back." Syraxis nodded without speaking, her gaze steady as always. She had placed her trust in him, and Jack couldn't afford to fail her. Not now. Not when they were this close. With a final deep breath, Jack pushed open the heavy door. It creaked as it swung wide, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, a handful of the most influential nobles of the Zorathian court stood around a large, circular table. The room smelled faintly of incense, but the air was thick with the tension of a secret meeting. As soon as the door opened, all eyes turned to Jack and Syraxis. The nobles' expressions were a mix of surprise, suspicion, and something darker: resentment. One of the nobles, a tall figure with a face covered in intricate tattoos, stepped forward. "Queen Syraxis," he began, his voice dripping with disdain. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? You bring a human here. Are you truly so desperate for allies?" Jack's muscles tensed, but he forced himself to remain calm. Syraxis, however, didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice icy. "I bring the truth, Lord Varric, and the truth is that you and your allies have been plotting against me." The room fell into stunned silence. Jack felt the weight of their gazes, each one sharp and calculating. They had been exposed. The conspiracy had been revealed. Varric's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You are a fool, Syraxis," he hissed. "You and this human have no place in Zorathian rule. The throne is mine. Ours." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected the confrontation to happen so quickly, but here it was. He glanced at Syraxis, who stood firm, her hands clasped in front of her, as if the weight of the situation didn't faze her at all. "I don't think so," Jack said, stepping forward with a sense of determination he hadn't realized he had until that moment. "You see, it's not just about power, Varric. It's about trust. And right now, the only person in this room who's earned my trust is Queen Syraxis. So if you think you're going to take her throne, you've got another thing coming." The nobles exchanged looks, some of them sneering, others silently calculating their next move. Jack's words hung in the air, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he'd just made a huge mistake. But Syraxis, her eyes flickering with approval, spoke next. "I trusted you, human, and now I see that I was right to do so. This man is the only one here who has proven himself." The nobles were stunned. The power had shifted. Jack had become more than just an accidental suitor. He had become an ally, someone Syraxis could rely on in the most dangerous of times. "We will fight together," Syraxis continued, her voice cold but powerful. "If you want my throne, you'll have to take it from me. And you will find that I, and the human who stands beside me, will not be easily defeated. The room was filled with the quiet hum of tension as the conspirators realized that their plot had failed. Jack didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just some pawn in an alien queen's political game. He was a part of something bigger now, and he wasn't about to back down. The real fight had just begun. The days following the confrontation with the conspirators were filled with a tense silence. The palace, once alive with whispers of rebellion, was now hushed, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Jack walked the halls of the palace with Syraxis by his side, the weight of their recent victory still settling in. They had exposed the traitors, but they had also made enemies, powerful ones who would stop at nothing to tear them apart. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was only just beginning. The nobles who had once schemed in the shadows were now glaring at him openly, their cold eyes full of disdain. But it wasn't just the nobles. The entire empire was watching. A human, an outsider, was standing by the queen's side, and many felt that their way of life was being threatened. As the days passed, Jack and Syraxis continued to meet with the remaining factions of the Zorathian court, trying to secure their loyalty. Some of the nobles grudgingly accepted the new status quo, but others were not so easily swayed. Tensions were high, and Jack could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. One evening, after yet another tense meeting, Jack and Syraxis found themselves alone in her private chambers. The grand windows overlooked the city, its lights twinkling like stars in the distance. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the fabrics in the cool breeze. Syraxis stood by the window, her arms crossed, staring out at the horizon. "Do you ever get tired of this?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. "I mean, all the politics, the constant scheming. Does it ever end?" Syraxis turned her head slightly, her violet eyes meeting his. "No, it doesn't. Not for those in power." Jack sighed, walking over to stand beside her. "I can't imagine what it's like to have everything you do constantly questioned. It's exhausting." She nodded, her gaze softening for a brief moment. "It is. But that's why I need people I can trust. People who will stand by me no matter what." Jack studied her, seeing the vulnerability that she rarely showed to anyone. In that moment, he realized something. Despite everything, the trials, the conspiracies, the pressure, they had built something together. A bond that had formed not just from necessity, but from mutual respect and understanding. They were no longer just queen and accidental suitor. They were allies, equals. "I'm with you, Syraxis," Jack said quietly. "Not because of some accident or obligation, but because I believe in what you're trying to do. I believe in you." Syraxis turned fully to face him, her eyes searching his for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, she allowed herself a small smile. "And I believe in you, Jack. You've shown me what it means to trust. You've proven yourself in ways no one else has. I thought I knew what loyalty was, but you've taught me it's more than just a word. It's something we choose, every day." For a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. The world outside was still full of challenges, but together, they were strong. Jack reached out, taking her hand gently. She didn't pull away. Instead, she clasped his hand in return, her grip firm and steady. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Jack asked. Syraxis looked out over the city once more, her expression resolute. "Yes, there will be more trials, more struggles, but we will face them together, as equals." And for the first time, Jack felt a sense of peace. They had faced the hardest part. Now, with their bond stronger than ever, they could take on whatever came next, together. The palace was quiet. The usual hustle of servants and courtiers was muted as Jack walked alongside Syraxis down the grand hallway. The once tense atmosphere had eased, but the weight of what they had achieved hung in the air. The conspirators had been defeated, but the struggle wasn't over. There was still much work to be done to solidify their power and their future, and the road ahead was uncertain. But as Jack glanced at Syraxis, he knew one thing for sure. They were no longer just allies. They were partners. Their bond had grown stronger with each challenge they faced. The Queen, once a distant and seemingly untouchable figure, had become someone Jack could trust completely. And in turn, Syraxis had begun to see Jack as more than just a human. He was her equal, her support in a world that sought to tear them apart. "I've been thinking," Jack said, breaking the silence as they walked. Syraxis raised an eyebrow, turning to look at him. "About what?" "I'm not sure if I'm cut out for ruling an empire," Jack said with a chuckle. "I mean, I barely know how to make my own breakfast half the time." Syraxis smiled, though her eyes remained serious. "You've proven yourself more than capable. Ruling is not about knowing everything. It's about knowing who to trust and how to work together." Jack nodded. He understood now. The challenges they faced weren't just about overcoming obstacles or winning battles. It was about the relationships they built, the trust they cultivated. And together, they had created something stronger than either of them could have achieved alone. They stopped in front of a large, ornate door, and Syraxis turned to him. "There's one more thing we need to do." Jack tilted his head. "What's that?" The door opened, and they stepped into a grand chamber filled with nobles. They were standing in a circle, their eyes on the two of them as they entered. Jack felt a wave of unease, but Syraxis stood tall beside him, her presence commanding the room. "This is the final step," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "We have proven our strength. We have exposed the conspirators. Now we must unite this empire under one banner, one vision." The nobles remained silent, their eyes flickering between Jack and Syraxis. But Jack could feel the shift. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about the future they could build together. They had already proven their loyalty to each other, and now they needed to prove it to the empire. "We stand together," Jack said, stepping forward. "Not because of an accident or some misplaced gesture, but because we believe in this empire. We believe in its future. And we will make that future strong together." There was a long pause, but then, one by one, the nobles began to nod, some in agreement, others reluctantly. But the message was clear. They were no longer divided. Syraxis turned to Jack, her expression softer than it had ever been. "This is just the beginning, Jack. We've made it this far. And together, we will make sure this empire thrives." Jack smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't thought possible. This was no longer just about surviving. It was about creating something better. And with Syraxis by his side, he knew anything was possible. As they left the chamber, Jack looked out at the stars through the palace windows. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibility. They had come a long way, but the journey was just beginning. And no matter what happened next, they would face it together. The beginning of something new was just ahead.